The past few days you've been traveling through Slovakia, Poland, around the border regions, and now you've just come out of Ukraine. What is your impression with the people you've been meeting and the stories you've been hearing?
So here's a number of impressions. You won't be surprised. First of all is the magnificent resources that are available to help the refugees. You're talking about over 4 million refugees that have fled Ukraine. 3 million have been embraced by Poland alone. So we've been to Poland, we've been to Slovakia, and then we were able to go to Ukraine. And in addition to those who have left the country for safety and security, there are people displaced within Ukraine itself. So the need, the emergency is of tsunami proportions, right? And just to see how smoothly, how well oiled, how beautifully choreographed all the aid is has been an inspiration to me. I kind of feared that we would find panic, and we've only seen serenity. Now, they are quick to say, well, now it's been almost 2 months, and at the beginning it was kind of emergency and panicky. Now the flow of refugees is more tempered. So see, while the thought of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia tempts me to discouragement.
I've heard you call that pure evil.
Yeah, see, this is raw evil. And that tempts me to discouragement, to think, how can this tyrant get away with this? That and the suffering of the people. We saw a young man today in Lvov. He couldn't have been 20 years old. He was in a village where there was bombing. And ever since then, he just sits quietly. You can see that he's shattered. Inside, physically, he's fine. Inside, he's in turmoil. His poor grandmother is there with him. And so we've seen intense suffering, but we also see people who are resilient and hopeful, and they've got a grit about them. And that gives me confidence as well.
I was in Ukraine last week when they were celebrating their Easter. And people still coming out to celebrate Easter at a time of war. And in the face of that raw evil, as you call it, how can people keep the resilience and their faith at a time
like that? Well,
let
the people of Ukraine teach us, Colm, because more than one Ukrainian, either in Ukraine or the refugees here, have said to me, this war is never good. But if it had to happen, it was providential that it happened during Lent, when we think of the dying, the suffering, the passion, the death of Jesus, when it looked as if darkness and evil and death had conquered, and then for the glory of his resurrection on Easter. And these Ukrainians said to me, we know by our faith that he wants us to go through that too. Our own passion, our own dying, our own Good Friday, but we know that the resurrection will come. You know, Colm, you see, the people of Ukraine have a PhD in suffering. If you study their history, they've always been attacked. Russia has always kicked them in the stomach, all right? Stalin tried, look at what Bismarck did. Stalin tried to starve them to death, all right? The communists treated them with harassment and persecution. Stalin sent 90% of the Catholic priests in Poland to Siberia, most of whom did not return. They are, unfortunately, they are experienced in suffering. In many ways, they are like the Jews who have suffered throughout their entire history. So they know that the suffering will be intense, but they know that ultimately the truth and goodness and beauty will prevail. And this gets them through.
We mentioned Ukraine being a very faithful country, Russia a very faithful country too. How do you reckon in your head, Your Eminence, people in Russia who are people of faith, who believe, but who also support this war?
We can't understand it except for a number of things. I'm a church historian, okay? Whenever in history you have religion and nationalism united, you've got trouble. Now, nationalism is different than patriotism. Patriotism is virtue, okay? Nationalism is a vice, and it's an excessive allegiance to one's country, even over God, all right? So when you get religion and nationalism bonded, you got trouble, and that, of course, is what has happened in Russia. To think that religious leaders who preach so well, but to think that somebody like Putin could look to his faith to justify this, it's very difficult to understand. I, for one, at times, thank God that we have a God who cries. We saw Jesus, his only begotten Son, cry, and he cries at this. As Pope Francis has said, to use devotion, allegiance to a nation, to use that to justify a war is idolatry, and it violates the first commandment, and he's right.
As a church historian, we know throughout history the church has always advocated for peace. Even there was an encyclical, Peace on Earth. What is the best way for the church to advocate for peace, using its resources and its influence, and do you think it is doing a good enough job now?
Well, we can always do better, but I'm very grateful for what the church is doing. And it usually comes down to three ways that we as believers can help. And this is important because so many people say, what can we do? Okay? So there's three ways. One is prayer. And we never, ever, ever underestimate that, the power of prayer. Number two is advocacy. So prayer and advocacy. Advocacy means we would stand up for those people. We would speak against the atrocity. And thirdly is aid, assistance, which we've seen such radiant ways of assistance. So those three, prayer, advocacy, and assistance, that's when we got a winning recipe.
Finally, Your Eminence, how do you think this is going to play out?
Well, I don't know. It's hard enough for me to speak in a compelling way about religion, and I'm supposed to be an expert on this. But on the political sphere, I do not know. People smarter than me seem to be on two sides. One says maybe Putin has said, I didn't expect this resistance, and I didn't expect the opposition of the world, and maybe he is looking for a graceful exit. Let's hope so. On the other side, and I'm afraid they may be more realistic, they are saying, uh-oh, you bet Putin is met with resistance. You bet he's in a corner, and look out. Because is there any limit to his resources? And is there any limit to what he can do? We just today in Ukraine went to a place where they had clean water. And I said, oh, this is good for the refugees. And they said, oh no, we have to get this to our people, because in the east, where the fighting is intense and where the destruction has been particularly vicious, the Russians have literally poisoned their wells and poisoned the rivers. The Ukrainians said, one thing we Ukrainians had in abundance was water with our rivers, and the Russians have poisoned it. Now, if you're going to use those kind of weapons, I just tremble to think what might be in store.